Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
A very good afternoon to you. The cases of two young men whose rape prosecutions were thrown out of court over problems relating to disclosure of evidence have been discussed at the last PMQs of the year.
That's right. Theresa May said a review is underway to ensure in future that justice is done. Well, earlier, Scotland Yard said it will conduct a major investigation into all its current rape and sex abuse investigations after the two cases collapsed in less than a week.
This morning I met Liam Allen, the young student whose life was put on hold for 2 years and had to endure torture until his case collapsed last week, and this week another case collapsed because of lack of disclosure. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that when allegations are made there should be a full investigation and there should be full disclosure given to the CPS and to both lawyers?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend raises an important point. This issue of disclosure is one that obviously has come to a focus of concern as a result of the case that he has quoted, and indeed I understand another case which is in the press today. But what I can tell him is that my right honourable friend, the Attorney General, had, even before these cases came up, actually initiated a review into disclosure. I think it is important that we look at this again to make sure that we are truly providing justice.
In national figures from 2016 to 2017, the volume of rape referrals from the police to the CPS fell by over 200 from the previous year to 6,611.
Well, there were more than 5,000 rape prosecutions this year. 45% of these were allegedly against child victims.
The number of convictions rose to nearly 3,000, the highest number ever recorded, with an 11% rise. Well, our correspondent, Enda Brady, is here. Enda, how significant is this?
Well, disclosure is hugely significant. It goes to the heart of ensuring that everyone gets a fair trial. So effectively what the police have is disclosed to both the prosecution and the defence. And it's quite obvious we're now finding out that often disclosure is happening late, and it's happening at a stage in the process where perhaps a defendant has been on bail for a significant amount of time, with a trial hanging over them for all of that time out on bail. So it's very, very significant indeed. This review we're hearing today will look at about 30 cases due to go to trial imminently and scores of other live investigations. So it will be the Metropolitan Police in discussion with the Crown Prosecution Service and looking at everything they have been working on. So very significant today's development indeed. We can take a look at a statement we've had through from the Metropolitan Police Commander Richard Smith, who oversees their rape investigations unit. He says the Met is completely committed to understanding what went wrong in the case of Mr Allen and is carrying out a joint review with the CPS, the findings of which will be published. Rape investigations are, by their nature, very complex and often hinge on the contradictory accounts of the alleged suspect and the complainant about what has taken place. Now, a lot of speculation in the newspapers today that basically police are under huge pressure to increase conviction rates, and off the back of that pressure on officers, they are ending up making basic errors in terms of disclosure, and that is really harming the whole process. So it's a very, very significant announcement today.
Enda, thank you.
Well, to get more on this, let's speak to Liam Allen now. His case was the first out of those two cases to be thrown out of court in the last week, and he joins me now from our central London studio. Thank you very much for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. And Theresa May saying that she's hoping that from this review that it will somehow allow for justice to be done. This is a significant review, as our correspondent was saying, by the Metropolitan Police and including the CPS. Do you think it will be enough to ensure that justice is done in the case of rape investigations?
I think you'll only really know when it's enough if, you know, after it's sort of passed and see what the outcome is realistically. I think they're doing as much as they can in such short notice in terms of that. But I feel like the first steps are being taken that are correct. I mean, given what happened in the news earlier, yeah, it seems like things are going in the right direction.
I mean, this was put to the Prime Minister during PMQs by Nigel Evans. He famously also had rape allegations and quashed in the end. And now he's been campaigning for anonymity for people who are accused. What did you speak to him about exactly? He actually mentioned you saying that he spoke to you about the mental torture that you went through.
Yeah, we had a brief discussion in terms of, you know, the anonymity side of it. I think it's fair that both parties remain anonymous. In terms of, you know, judgment is passed automatically. It's just something that people do without even realising consciously. And so, you know, it's not really fair if you haven't even been judged yourself to be judged by other people in the public's eye. So, yeah, fully support the anonymity side of it. But we just sort of spoke about, you know, how we'd felt about it, you know, what we'd went through. And, you know, it's relatable for everyone, really, that's gone through it. You feel similar sort of emotions, but everyone's experience is unique, really.
I think the issue is, though, that rape campaigners saying that, look, it's really vital to try and protect people who have been the victim of rape or sexual abuse. And with the conviction rate being so low, 11% in terms of the conviction rate, it's very important, as far as they're concerned, that actually names are put out there.
I suppose there's both sides to the story, really. You know, I've tried to be supportive of both sides as best as I possibly can, but unless there's reason to believe that more people are going to come forward if that name's released, then no, it's not fair to release your name at all. Because, as I said, you're going to be judged before you've even been met by people that don't know you specifically. So, yeah,
no,
there is
right.
both sides to it.
Look, you are right. There are two sides to this story, and that's the difficulty when it comes to dealing and tackling with rape cases. You're essentially fighting one person's word over another. But saying that, what, in your opinion, particularly bearing in mind what you went through when you were on bail for 2 years, and while this case was being investigated and indeed it was thrown out eventually, in your opinion, what's the best way to deal with this to make sure victims are protected, also people who are accused of rape are also protected, and indeed the just outcome is reached?
See, this is the difficult side of it. I don't really know what you can do to protect somebody. My suggestion from the very start has always been, you know, if you have 2 officers per case in terms of, you know, investigating it, why is one not investigating if you're innocent and the other one investigating if you're guilty? You know, it sort of gets rid of pre-assumptions in that sort of aspect as well. But I mean, the system from start to finish just seemed to have holes in it and gaps. So, you know, you might not be able to necessarily protect their identities, but making sure that the right outcome comes through for both victims and falsely accused. You know, there's got to be something, you know, a step-by-step process that people have to meet. That there's no possible way of people being able to cut corners, hide information. You know, if you hide an information or you're not seeing something as relevant but hasn't been, you know, looked at by somebody else, then you're giving people the opportunity to make their own judgment and make the case fit their judgment if they're able to hide stuff. So yeah.
And of course, today we got news of the other rape case, which was thrown out of court. Very similar reasons, all due to the lack of disclosure. Now, the detective constable who oversaw your case, and also this case of this 25-year-old man, he's staying in, working in full duty within Scotland Yard. And what are your thoughts on that? How do you feel about that?
You know, if there's a pattern for somebody's behaviour, then, you know, there's questions of intent, so I can understand that side of it. I don't hold him solely responsible, and I don't think the other person would either, because there are other failures. I mean, there's people that review this information, so I mean, if we're talking of suspensions and taking people out of work, everyone that reviewed that case, you know, lawyers, everyone sort of across the board that had that information somewhere or knew it existed, or, you know, didn't know it existed but didn't bother looking for it, you know, then they should all be taken off, because it's the same with his case. There's going to be somebody else that reviewed it, that looked at that information somewhere. There has to be. I find it impossible to believe that just one person looked at that information. So there's a collective responsibility across the board.
Liam, a very difficult and complicated situation, but really appreciate you taking the time to talk to Sky News this afternoon. Thank you.
No worries, thank you.
Well, we can also talk to the barrister and former Conservative MP, Jerry Hayes, who prosecuted Mr Allen's case. Really appreciate you talking to us this afternoon, Jerry. I mean, in Liam's case, it was a disc that was found by accident, which ultimately led to his case being thrown out of court. What does that suggest about the current system?
Oh, the current system has been broken for a long time, and we've been making it absolutely clear to government that there's a systematic cultural problem within the police. They don't seem to understand that they are statutorily obliged to look at the whole issue, look at all the evidence. And there's two tests. If an officer finds that there's something which is capable of actually undermining the prosecution case, the CPS must be told. If the disclosure officer who's looking at the various bits of evidence says that there's something or finds there's something which actually assists the defence case, the CPS should be told, and they should give it all to the defence. This did not happen at all.
Are police officers in the Crown Prosecution Services, Crown Prosecution Service, under pressure to increase the number of conviction rates? Because Angela Rafferty, QC, the chair of the Criminal Bar Association, she's spoken of an unconscious bias.
Yes, I think that's probably true. But what you had here is not just a rogue police officer. I don't think there was any particular dishonesty. It was just pure incompetence. And officers have got to be properly trained, to be told this is your statutory obligation. You're not there just to build a defence case. And what Liam was saying earlier about anonymity, some of us have been arguing for that for years. And in fact, what I believe should happen, there should be a presumption that we don't know the name of the accused until conviction, unless the prosecutor persuades a Crown Court judge that it would impede other people coming forward. But there's not a level playing field at the moment. Everything seems to be skewed. The dice are rolled against the accused at the moment, and that's not wrong, that's not right, it's not British justice.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance because you don't want to deter victims from coming forward in the first place.
No, and it's encouraging. I'm heartened that so many, and please don't use the word victim, I know you don't mean to, but they are complainants. They become victims after conviction. So if someone is an accuser, of course we want them to come forward. We don't want them to be deterred. We want there to be justice. But justice must be balanced. It must be equal. There must be a level playing field.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking at these two cases, Isaac, he's 25 years old, Liam, 22 years old. These are young men who have their whole lives ahead of them. We've got to get this right. This is central to our justice system.
Well, it's terrible. These are two cases. How many more are there going to be? Now, I'm pleased and I welcome what the Metropolitan Police have said. They're going to review all live cases. This should happen in every police force throughout the land. It's not just in London. It's everywhere, and it's got to be stopped.
Well, on that point, if there is a case, somebody's been accused somewhere else in the country, they're about to go to court, I mean, what do? What is their position now?
Well, firstly, hope they've got a conscientious solicitor, and hopefully they've got a competent barrister, because they will dig and dig and dig and dig and ask for disclosure, Now, in the second case, I was speaking to the barrister who was dealing with the case which was binned yesterday in the London Crown Court. They had been asking for this disclosure for months. Why? And we've got to have an inquiry into this. Why weren't they given it? This man could have gone to prison, Liam could have gone to prison for 12 years and been on a sexual offenders register for the rest of his life. His reputation would have been trashed. Thank God it wasn't.
And if there is a systemic cultural problem up and down the country, I mean, we are just focusing on the Metropolitan Police here, but if this is a systemic problem, what does that mean for those who have already been convicted of rape?
Well, there's the next problem. Do you open every single rape case? I suspect the Court of Appeal might be rather full, because you can actually have an appeal on fresh evidence. But if it hasn't been revealed to anybody, if the police have just got the disc, they would have disappeared ages ago. So there is a possibility that there could have been some quite serious miscarriages of justice. It's going to take a lot of sensitive reviewing.
Jerry Hayes, thanks for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now to other news we've been covering on Sky News this afternoon. Both a government review and a Met Police investigation are underway into the full disclosure of evidence by police officers to the Crown Prosecution Service and legal teams in cases of rape and other sex crimes. Well, joining me now are the legal commentator Joshua Rosenberg, Dal Beibu, who's a former Chief Superintendent with the Metropolitan Police. Both of them join me from our central London studio. And also joining me is Gabrielle Brown. She is a rape victim and a campaigner. And as I say, joining me in the studio. Dal, if I could start with yourself. Two rape cases collapsing in the space of just a few days, all centred around the lack of disclosure of evidence. This is hugely embarrassing for the Metropolitan Police, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's caused some difficulties. What we need to understand that there is not one point in law where you need to do disclosure. Disclosure will come throughout the development of a case. So let's take, for example, an allegation of rape. A person makes an allegation of rape, then there will be evidence collected. During the course of that investigation, evidence will be presented, and it's the undisclosed evidence that the police will then share with the CPS, and who will then jointly make a decision about whether that's disclosed to the defence team. So I think what we need to understand is the complexity of this matter. So it will be phone downloads, it'll be Facebook messages, it'll be Twitter, and there could be a whole range of evidence which isn't available immediately. So I think we need there's a real level of complexity in gathering all this material.
I mean, Gabrielle, I'm going to come to you in a moment. I just would like to speak to Joshua very quickly. And the reason being, Joshua, it's fine that we are going to have a review. I'm sure many people are going to welcome this. However, you would have thought that something like the disclosure of evidence, that would be something that all police forces do automatically. This shouldn't be something that needs to be looked into, surely.
It's not that difficult, and certainly, you know, there can be delays in disclosure, but everything has to be disclosed before the trial begins, and that's what seems to have gone wrong here. And we're going to have a new inquiry, but there have been inquiries in the past. There was a review 6 months ago by the inspectorates of the police and the Crown Prosecution Service. That exposed a number of failings, said things need to be sorted out, and it said in particular within 6 months the CPS, the Prosecution Service, needed to comply with guidelines on disclosures and ensure that every defence statement is reviewed by a prosecutor. It's not that difficult.
Gabrielle, as somebody who successfully was able to get a rape conviction, I can understand that this is a difficult thing to do. Number one, when you look at the number of rape convictions, only around 11%. Yeah. What was your experience like at the time in terms of dealing with the CPS, dealing with police forces? Because they have been criticised in the past of not necessarily believing people who claim to be victims, and they've been criticised for that. So the argument can be, I know one particular newspaper is pushing that they are trying to deal with that conviction rate. They are trying to end that reputation that actually they don't take victims seriously enough.
I think taking victims seriously is almost a separate issue to what's going on. I experienced this full disclosure to defence in my own case. So my own case took a ridiculous long period of time to come to trial, 6 weeks short of 2 years for it to come to trial at the Old Bailey. So that gives you an indication of the seriousness of the offence that it ended up at the Old Bailey, but equally the amount of time. During that time, the CPS lost the court papers. Without my involvement, if I'd have taken no action, no prosecution would have happened. It's a fact that's accepted by the Met. I do a lot of work with the Met, and generally what disappoints me about this is I felt that there has been a big surge towards helping the victim position and supporting the victim through it. So a week before trial, I had a file of correspondence. I'd communicated with the Director of Public Prosecutions, high-profile MPs. The Crown Prosecutor asked me to pass all my correspondence, including emails, including all digital data, to my police liaison officer so it could be passed to the defence under full disclosure. That was all the way back in 2005. Full disclosure is not a new thing. It's very traumatic for a victim, and I would ask the question how in these cases and others that are now going to be reviewed, how do the police and the CPS intend to support those victims? Because the emotional impact of this is devastating. When I was asked to hand my file over a week before trial, it was the most traumatic point, if you bear in mind the offence that occurred and all the various delays in getting the case to trial. Being asked to then hand my evidence of the mishandling of my case over to the prosecution was profound. A year later, 2 years later to be precise, my offender was on licence, so he was released from prison. Went on to commit huge numbers of further offending. He was up on a separate charge. The Crown Prosecution Service had failed to submit key CCTV and DNA evidence that was damning. It was damning to the point that it proved my offender's guilt for that offence. The judge, quite rightly, although as a victim I would take a different view, but I'm interested in the fairness of justice above all else. It's not in my interest or any other victims to have a token offender. I don't want an offender or an accused convicted if they shouldn't be. That's the bottom line. So this evidence that would have convicted the same person who tried to rape me was not allowed by the judge on the basis that defence didn't have sufficient time to build a case. It is absolute. This is elementary. I sit on a MOPAC scrutiny panel in a different area of criminal justice where we look at procedures. This is exactly the sort of thing where scrutiny needs to happen, but it needs to happen on an every case basis.
I think Gabrielle really highlighting here the difficulties when it comes to tackling sex abuse cases. How can police be getting it so wrong? We understand that indeed that you must listen to victims and you must also try to find justice. At the same time, you don't want to go to the other side where indeed the people who are accused are also not getting the protection that potentially they might need, particularly if they are innocent. How can police and the Criminal Prosecution Service be getting it so wrong here?
Well, I'm not sure that, that there is a widespread evidence of the police getting it wrong here or the CPS getting it wrong here. These are difficult situations. Now, Gabrielle, an incredibly brave individual, has talked about the trauma of what happens when you disclose all this material. Now, there will be a requirement to disclose all unused material, but that's not available from day one, and it's really important to understand.
It is available as the case progresses. At the point I was asked to disclose my evidence, that was a week before trial. In the lead up to trial, it was 6 weeks short of 2 years. You cannot say during that time there was insufficient time in the lead up to trial to get me to disclose any evidence that may or may not have been relevant. In fact, as it happened, the forensic evidence and the other evidence was so damning that my offender pleaded guilty on the first day of trial. It didn't stop the distress and the trauma caused to the victim by me being asked to disclose my evidence at such a late date when I was already stressed about the idea of trial at the Old Bailey. What procedures do the Met or do any other police force have in place to provide support to a victim where the police and or the Crown Prosecution Service make a mess of this disclosure? What support is in place to ensure that the victim doesn't do some drastic action to themselves because they are so further traumatised that not only have they gone through 2 years of build-up where their life is on hold, who's there to support the victim at the end of the day? Basically nobody. The trial.
Let's let Dal respond. Dal, go ahead. Sorry.
I think the challenge is not all the information is available from day one. So the police will have to send off phones. They'll have to get authority to look at Facebook. They'll have to get authority to look at Twitter. All of this is not automatically available to the officers. So I think there is an issue about resources. You know, the police service has been reduced by 20% in the last 5-6 years. There's a knock-on effect around forensic support services that are available and outsourcing.
Can I just make one point? You're talking about services. The fundamental message I would like to get to any serving police officer, any Crown prosecutor, is victims are real people with real lives. We are not cases, we are not files. Treat us as real people, treat us considerately and respectfully. If a decision is not the outcome that we would like to see, we can handle it, but we need to be treated respectfully. And the way these cases and these victims are being treated is not respectful.
And I've just spoken to Mr. Allen before this, and I think he's feeling, he's a young man, he's absolutely traumatised what's actually happened. And I think what we need to be doing is making sure that we understand that everybody involved in the criminal justice system wants to ensure that we get justice. If it means that we put all the evidence together, and the police are basically witnesses, they gather the evidence, the CPS make the decision about whether somebody is charged or not, and ultimately the jury and the judge, or the judge and jury, will decide whether somebody's guilty or not. I think it's really, really important to understand the complexity of what as we move into the IT world. So the old days where you would have had less reliance on IT to get that disclosure, we've been told there's literally thousands of messages on the disk that was not properly disclosed.
I mean,
so that's an indication of just how much work a police officer has.
Okay, Dal, let me just get back to, let's bring Joshua back in. I think what Dal and both Gabrielle are both highlighting, indeed, as Dal mentioned, the complexities of a rape case. There very rarely are witnesses. It usually just boils down to one person's word against the other. But the situation remains that CPS, police forces, they can get it wrong. It's not working. It's not working for those who are the victims and also for those who are accused, those who are innocent and accused.
I sympathise with Dal's position because he's right to say the police are under-resourced. But look at what the two inspectorates said 6 months ago. They referred to what's called poor scheduling. In other words, recording details of the evidence, and that in turn was not being challenged by prosecutors. They said the police are routinely failing to comply with guidance and requirements when recording this data, this information that they've obtained from witnesses. Many officers submitted schedules that had missing or deficient data. It said the College of Policing is meant to provide training, and many officers admitted they lack confidence in their role and their responsibilities. Prosecutors are expected to reject substandard schedules, but there was little evidence that these prosecutors were challenging the police when they had failed to provide information. The problems uncovered by the inspectorate were of the police simply not listing with enough detail the information they'd obtained from witnesses to enable the prosecutors to challenge them, and therefore disclosure not happening. There is detailed consideration of this available if only the police would act on it.
Gabrielle, what's your response to that?
My response to that is I find it very, very disappointing, because the overriding thing that went wrong in my own case was procedural incompetence, with members of all criminal justice agencies not doing their routine bread and butter job properly. There is a far greater need for scrutiny, for maybe more senior officers to have greater, closer overview as the case progresses. It is not in the interests of justice to have somebody up before the court who shouldn't be there. I would resist saying we should allow a longer time, because basically the longer the time a case comes to trial, the far less likelihood there is of a successful prosecution. But I mean, this is your routine work. I fail to understand how a case cannot be managed properly, and what we're talking about is mismanagement of cases.
OK, Gabrielle, but I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on Sky News, and also Dal Badebu and Joshua Rosenberg. Thank you all for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Thank you.
Meanwhile, the Metropolitan Police say that while Liam Allen's case needs to be looked into, it's difficult to examine all evidence, especially with more digital evidence now than ever before.
It's clear to us that something went wrong. We are very keen to find out exactly what that is and see what we can learn from that. The review has started. It started immediately with the CPS. Later today, I'll be speaking to the CPS about how far we've progressed jointly with that. And we have agreed that we will be publishing the outcome of that. But I think it's too early for me to be commenting when the review is part-way through. And part of the issue here is that quantity of digital media that is generated even in fairly straightforward cases.
Joined by Angela Rafferty, QC, Chair of the Criminal Bar Association. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Let's talk about that digital evidence to start with, should we, and the challenges that we're hearing from the Metropolitan Police. They say that raises, surely all evidence should be made available in a case when someone may lose their liberty.
I agree, and I think that resources should be made available for all evidence to be looked at properly by the police and by the Crown Prosecution Service. And really, the quantity of digital evidence shouldn't be a reason for people to face miscarriage of justice.
Talk to us, I know that you've been talking earlier about an unconscious bias. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's important when people or police officers are investigating cases to look at it from both sides of the case. And sometimes it may be tempting to investigate one way and not look at the other side of the story. And that's something that I'm hoping that the review will deal with, to see if that's been happening at all in these cases and in other cases.
You say that it's not for the police or the Crown Prosecution Service to judge, but they must have to think that there is a case to answer before it progresses to court.
Well, criminal cases are decided by juries, by magistrates, and sometimes by judges. The investigators should be fair. Innocent people are accused of crimes that they haven't committed. So it's very important for those who are investigating to look at evidence that might assist those who are accused as well as incriminate them, in my view.
So who then should decide on the merits of a case being prosecuted or being brought to court?
Well, the Crown Prosecution Service has a two-stage test. Is the case in the public interest, and is there an evidential threshold that has been made? But after that, the disclosure is in the hands of the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, and it is they who must apply the test as to whether it assists or may assist a defendant's case or undermine its own case. And so therefore that test must be rigorously applied if the interests of justice are to be satisfied.
There's been much discussion, has there not, of course, about the anonymity of those under suspicion in the past and whether or not that is helpful to society as a whole. What's your view on that?
My view in relation to the anonymity of victims and defendants is that it's something that we should have a public debate about. It is something that keeps coming up again and again, and there are finely balanced arguments on both sides.
And what do you think those are?
In my view, the anonymity for victims is obviously a very important protection for people in very difficult situations who are coming forward with very personal allegations. In relation to defendants, those who are falsely accused can face, as Liam Allen has, very severe consequences by being publicly named. And so, in my view, we should start a debate about this, although I can see that for those who have committed many offences who may not be detected if not publicised, there is an argument to say that open justice should prevail and their names should be published.
So on one side you've got the argument of Liam Allen and the fact that, you know, he has 2 years under the spotlight, and he would say that his life has been destroyed, certainly in the short term. And then on the other side of the argument you have cases like Jimmy Savile and the like, where because there wasn't anonymity in those cases, more victims came forward. It's difficult and it's challenging.
It is. I think I would agree with that.
And if you were to be pressed, you would come down on which side?
I'd like to hear more evidence in relation to the potential miscarriages of justice that we have heard about. I'd like to read the review into disclosure, which is what I think is the most pressing issue here. Not anonymity at this stage, but whether the system could have gone very wrong for the young man Liam Allen and the other case that we've heard publicity about today.
And to go back to where we started, the disclosure process, as I said, as I made the point, and perhaps you could just explore it for us just a little bit more before we let you go. I'm sure that people who are watching this afternoon would find it difficult to believe that, you know, all evidence that is available is not made available to those that need to know in a court of law.
Yes, well, the Criminal Bar Association and criminal barristers have been saying for many years there's a real problem in this area. There's been a recent report in July of this year describing widespread and systemic failures in the disclosure process. We've been concerned about miscarriages of justice. It is difficult to understand how these things could have happened, and it's got to be explored and it's got to be stopped. There is a lack of resources generally in the criminal justice system. So that is one area that needs to be looked at. And in relation to training of officers and CPS staff, that must happen too.
OK, it's good to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to join us here on Sky News this afternoon. Thank you.
Britain's biggest police force, the Metropolitan Police, is reviewing all its current sex offence investigations after the collapse of 2 rape cases in the space of a week. Both prosecutions were halted because the police had failed to disclose key evidence which might have helped their defence. Several legal experts are now warning that this may reflect a wider issue across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Here's our legal correspondent, Clive Coleman.
Are the scales of justice being unfairly tipped against defendants because the police aren't sharing evidence that could help their case? one of the founding principles of the criminal justice system, is beset by problems. The BBC understands Isaac Itiari spent months in jail, awaiting trial on charges of sexual activity with a child. The case against him was dropped yesterday when text messages from his alleged teenage victim's phone showed she routinely lied about her age. A few days earlier, the case against Liam Allen was stopped because text messages showed his alleged victim had enjoyed having sex with him.
In the last 2 years, I've just spent worrying and you know, not really concentrated on anything. And so it has completely ripped apart my normal sort of personal life.
The Metropolitan Police is now carrying out a review into what happened to Liam Allen and of the evidence in all its current rape and sex abuse cases.
That review is being conducted jointly with the CPS, so with the lawyers in each case and our investigating officers, to make sure that those cases are safe to go to trial. Our priority is those 30-something where trials are about to start. I have no reason to believe that there are any problems with any of those cases, but it is a pragmatic step to conduct that check now.
The police and Crown Prosecution Service have made huge efforts in recent years to right the wrongs of the past and ensure that alleged victims in rape and sexual assault cases are treated properly. But some fear that the process of disclosing evidence to the defence has been damaged as a result.
The Attorney General has started a review into disclosure. He thinks that part of the problem is the sheer weight of evidence.
We have very large amounts now of mostly digital information in a whole range of trials that it's very hard to filter and sift effectively so you can find the evidence that ought to be disclosed. And that's a problem that we're encountering in fraud cases, in terrorism cases, but also, as we've discovered, in other kinds of case too.
But there have been many damning reviews of the disclosure process in recent years, and some of those working in the criminal courts believe the system's integrity is now under threat.
The real danger here is that people can lose years of their lives locked up in prison for crimes that they haven't committed. That evidence that could show that they haven't committed those crimes, evidence that could show that they are innocent, isn't disclosed to them or their lawyers, and therefore there are grave miscarriages of justice.
The prosecution's duty to pass evidence to the defence, which assists the defence, underpins our justice system. That duty is now under scrutiny as never before. Clive Coleman, BBC News.
And our home editor Mark Easton is with me. Mark, is this a problem just for the Met, or are we dealing with something perhaps much wider?
Oh, I think it goes much wider than just rape cases in London. As Clive was saying, it might sound counterintuitive, but our justice system relies on the people doing the prosecuting, the police and the prosecution service, to give the defence anything that might undermine their case, their hopes of getting a conviction. So does it work? Well, only last summer, the people whose job it is to keep an eye on the police and prosecutors did an inspection and came up with some very troubling findings. They looked at 150 Crown Court trials, and in most of them, 55%, there were issues with initial disclosure, and most of those issues were never resolved. 3/4 of defence lawyers say the system's not good enough, and half of prosecution lawyers say the same. Now, there have been recommendations going back years for better training, supervision, systems. Others argue that it's really about money, more resources and expertise is needed because the complex cases these days involving a lot more data, and some think it may in fact be partly due to the fact that people want to improve conviction rates, particularly in things like rape trials. What should not be forgotten in all of this is that innocent people have ended up wrongly convicted of crimes because evidence has not been handed over. Getting this right is fundamental to our system of justice.
Mark, thank you very much.
Now, Scotland Yard is urgently reviewing about 30 rape and sexual abuse cases which were on the verge of coming to trial after 2 prosecutions collapsed in the last week. The Met said more sex cases would also be examined, but denied that systemic failures meant officers were breaking the rules set up to ensure a fair trial. The Justice Minister, Dominic Raab, described it as deeply worrying, declaring that the principle of British justice was at stake. Fatima Manji reports.
22-year-old Liam Allen came close to wrongly being convicted of rape. The police should have disclosed phone records which had text messages undermining the allegations made by the woman against him. But that only happened during the trial, and it was Liam and his barrister who found them.
It's just a stab in the back kind of thing. Everyone tells you that it's impartial,
But it's not. It really isn't, and this sort of highlighted it really. For me, I'm one of the lucky ones. They drag me through it, and so, you know, it's not just me that has implications on, you know, you've got family, you've got friends, and they all have to watch you go through it. I think that's harder because you can't do anything to help, you can't do anything to change it for them, even though you know in your heart for a fact that it's not true.
Yesterday, a second case of rape allegations was dropped after concerns police hadn't provided all the relevant evidence. An officer who worked on both cases has been removed from active investigations, and Scotland Yard say they're now reviewing around 30 rape cases due to go to trial.
We are not withholding evidence in any of these cases, but we also gather huge amounts of other material. That's called unused material in all these cases. We keep that, we maintain it under review to identify whether or not it has become relevant, and when it becomes relevant, it is disclosed. Clearly, in the Liam Allen case, that disclosure came very late. But it is not about withholding evidence. There is no suggestion any officer has withheld evidence in any of these cases.
But there are calls for further action. Parliament's former Deputy Speaker, Nigel Evans, himself cleared of sexual assault charges in 2014, accuses police of cherry-picking evidence to get a prosecution. Some in the legal profession believe cutbacks to policing and the prosecution service are partly to blame.
It's a positive thing that far more complaints of sexual assault are being made. Certainly there's been real priority given to improving the difficult ordeal that complainants have to go through, and that has led to more people feeling comfortable and able to come forward. But unless there's an increase in resources to manage all of that, then if the workload, inevitably the burden on those people investigating, increases. That's not an excuse for failing to behave in a competent fashion.
It is a complicated balance. How to protect the rights of those perhaps falsely accused, while trying to create a culture where victims of rape can feel confident in the system. A government-commissioned study estimates just 15% of those who experience sexual violence choose to go to the police. And just 1 in 3 rape allegations that reach court actually result in convictions.
What's your message to those people who might use your case to suggest that anyone making a complaint about rape is somehow lying?
That's wrong. I mean, people do get raped. It is a crime, and it does happen to people, and I am so sorry for anyone that has been through it and feels like I'm going up against that. I really do, because that's not the aim. If you can guarantee as a victim and someone that's falsely accused that you can rely on a system that does things correctly and looks at the evidence as a whole, both sides feel more confident.
Well, I'm joined now from Oxford by Dame Eilish Angiolini. She led an independent review in 2015 into how the Metropolitan Police and Crown Prosecution Service investigate and prosecute rape cases in London. Dame Eilish, if all of your recommendations had been taken up, would we still have a problem now?
Well, that's difficult to say because it's a hypothetical situation. What is clear is that the number of cases that are being reported to the police has increased very substantially even since 2015, which is what I did predict and alerted the government and the police authorities to say that the system was under huge strain. It's fantastic that people are reporting cases, but you need to have the wherewithal to investigate them thoroughly and fairly and with a very clear view about the rights of accused and suspects as well as those who are complainants.
So did you warn specifically about this issue of disclosure and the amount of evidence involved in so many cases? I mean, you know, can we say that this has been flagged and you know, we knew this was going to happen?
Well, I did identify that the sheer volume of evidence that's involved in a rape investigation. This has come particularly with the development of social media, email, texts, and CCTV evidence, so that rape cases and their investigation is very, very similar in terms of complexity and weight to the investigation of a murder case, and yet a murder case will attract a very substantial number of police officers devoted to the case, whereas rapes will not, because they are being reported in very, very great numbers.
So there is a resourcing issue then, is what you're saying, which many people have raised today. But is there also an issue around either police competence or attitude?
Well, I think that there is a a failure generally to recognise how complex and difficult these cases are to investigate. They take great skills and a lot of resilience, and many officers who I saw in 2015 were not just simply exhausted, but emotionally exhausted, dealing with sometimes very, very troubled complainants and having to persuade these complainants to remain within the system, particularly when it was taking so long to get to trial because of the delays and the work burdens which they were experiencing at that time. So it was not an enviable position. It wasn't a career development post as a matter of perception in the police force, and that's a problem because it is such a difficult area. It needs expertise, it needs highly skilled police officers.
Do you think there is an institutional sexism here? I mean, the criminal justice system fails women who have been sexually attacked or raped every day. I mean, you know, most don't have confidence in the system. Most cases do not result in successful prosecutions. And you're telling us now that there is a serious resourcing problem over the investigating of rape. I mean, is it that society, the system, does not take these crimes seriously enough?
When you say society, society has a notion of what rape is, and it tends to be someone being dragged off a road into a railway siding and raped. The vast majority of rape take place within family settings, within the house, within the home, or with people who are acquaintances. And many jurors will come to a court as a juror thinking that they're dealing with a different type of case. And therefore there's been a problem educating the public to understand the nature of this crime is one which is prolific and the vast bulk of which is never reported to anyone, not just the police, but many victims of rape will never tell a friend or their mother or anyone about this. Therefore, it's a real challenge to take these cases to court and to ensure that they're investigated efficiently, effectively, and with an understanding of the sensitivities to the complainants and the rights of the accused.
So you warned about this 2 years ago. You have raised tonight that resourcing is a massive issue, and yet the government has cut police numbers. Can we say that that has led to this problem getting worse?
I think that there's a combination of variables. I think there's a huge increase in cases. I think there are competing areas of criminality, such as terrorism and other areas. But there was also at one point, the previous Mayor of London described the need to have more frontline policing in the street. And the great tragedy is that some of these investigations of rape cases are seen as backroom policing. It's this type of work, disclosure, looking at telephone directories of evidence of texts over many, many months. This is very, very hard and very tedious work, but absolutely critical. And that is being done not in the streets, but being done in offices. And there has been understanding that that work is absolutely critical and needs to be supported.
Damien Elish-Angiolini, thank you very much indeed.
Now, rape cases are amongst the most sensitive, arguably the most sensitive to come before the courts. An ordeal for victims without any shadow of doubt. But devastating for anyone wrongly convicted too. Not just the sentence, but the lifelong stigma. No wonder then that London's Metropolitan Police has been trying to reassure us after a second bungled prosecution emerged in which it withheld evidence. That almost ended with innocent men being convicted. The Attorney General says it is appalling. The force says it will now review all current rape cases.
It is one of the central tenets of British justice that police disclose any evidence they hold that can help the accused mount a fair defence. But this week we've learnt in 2 separate rape cases that didn't happen as it should. Student Liam Allen was cleared after spending 2 years with multiple allegations of rape hanging over him. And now Isaac Ituri was freed after spending 4 months in jail awaiting trial. In both cases, police didn't disclose text messages from the alleged victims that totally undermined their claims until they were made to do so. The Metropolitan Police say they're now reviewing all rape cases imminent in court.
What we have instigated is a review, a check of all of our current cases, sex offence and rape cases, to ensure that the disclosure process in all of those cases has been completed as it should.
That means they're looking into all live sex crime cases, including more than 30 cases with trials about to start. But they admit there could be scores more that need investigation. And it's not clear what will happen to historical cases, including those that resulted in a conviction. convictions that could possibly have led to a miscarriage of justice.
If there is anybody within the criminal justice system who is deliberately withholding evidence they have possession of and that they know they should disclose because it could undermine the case they're seeking to make and it's proper for the defence to see and have access to that information, that would be extremely serious. Now, we don't know whether that's what's happened in these cases, but we need to find out urgently.
Urgent because they risk corroding public confidence in the criminal justice system.
This is just the tip of the iceberg, and it should be every single police force in the land who should be reviewing what's been going on. We've got to retrain police officers. They used to be told at detective colleges are 3 R's, which is retain, record and reveal. They don't.
Now questions are being raised over whether officers have been breaking rules set up to ensure trials are fair. Questions that some say puts the very principle of British justice at stake. Sejal Karia, News at 10.